Hi there, and welcome to Boris Effects' Flow State, stories from the creative process. I'm your host, Nick Haraz, and through one-on-one discussions with creative industry professionals, we aim to provide practical knowledge and insights, shedding light on the discipline, tools, and techniques that bring work to life. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Boris Effects, we're a leading developer of video editing, motion graphics, and visual effects plugins and software used in film, television, and video production. In this episode, we're joined by Chris Do, an influential figure in the design community and founder of The Future, an educational platform that empowers creative professionals with business skills. We invite you to join our community by subscribing to the podcast and to continue the conversation on our YouTube page, where you'll find additional content, including episode highlights. Thank you for tuning into Boris Effects' Flow State. Let's explore the art and science behind the creative industry together. Chris, thanks so much for joining me on this podcast, Flow State, and I'm so excited to catch up with you as well as pick your brain. How you been, man?
I've been great, Nick. Good talking to you again.
Yeah, good talking to you too. So, if I wanted to just dive in straight to a question, what is it that you think creativity means?
Oh, creativity is the ability to come up with innovative solutions to go from the way things are to the way things should be. And we can do that in a number of different ways. It's the ability for someone to imagine something that doesn't yet exist, to be able to connect disparate ideas in a new, novel, and useful way.
I love how you've distilled that down to a really useful sentence too. And how often do you find yourself leveraging creativity or finding creativity in your work?
I think the minute that you sit down and you connect to things that no one had seen before, even in writing, I think that's creative. So I think every day, every moment of my life is a creative moment or an opportunity for a creative moment.
Now, when you try to set up a space to be creative, do you find that there are certain types of day that you can leverage or tap more into creativity? Do you find that it could be space related, or is it just a question of being open?
I think certain habits and routines and environments are more conducive to creativity, and it's not what you think. First, I'll just say that the times I'm most creative is when I'm absolutely bored out of my mind, when I've had too much sleep and have nothing to do except for to exist. And in those moments, my mind is most fertile and it's able to make those connections, because I believe there's this connection between the active learning brain and the archival brain. Just to break it down. So the active learning brain is the one that you and I are using literally right now. We're taking input, we're trying to respond to things, and we're recording. The archival brain is usually our subconscious brain that's assembling everything that we've learned during that day when we're sleeping and connecting to everything we've ever learned in our entire life, even when we're pre-language. And so oftentimes when we're in a dream where it doesn't make any sense because it's sorting out what you've learned today, but in relative to your entire history, it's smashing things together. And so I find that when we're bored, we're using less of our active brain, what people would often refer to as the 10% that we're able to access at any given time. And we're tapping into that 90% that is available to us for those who know how to dip in and out. Some people do this through meditation. Some people do it through psychoactive drugs. And some people do it just by being bored and being silent.
When it comes to boredom, do you actually seek that out? And could you even pinpoint to me sometime in like the last week, a moment of boredom or stillness, and how that ended up allowing you to mesh a couple different things together in a unique perspective you might have not even thought had a connection?
Yes. I mean, all of us have moments of boredom, and I'll tell you the little moments, I'll tell you the big moments, and I'll get really specific. If you're washing the dishes or you're vacuuming the house, that's a moment where you're not really using your active brain because you've done it so many times. You're in an autonomic state. You're doing things without a lot of mental focus and concentration. When you're taking a shower, when you're washing your car, these repetitive tasks put you in this trance state when you're slipping in between the conscious and subconscious mind. And it's a pretty cool space to be. That's why most people have those eureka moments in the shower or right when they wake up from a good night's rest. And those moments are very precious because they're not stored in your long-term memory. And so we think, oh, I'll remember that idea. I'll remember that clever expression or something, and you won't. And that's the trick. So for me, when I'm writing content It's often that in that slip between the subconscious and conscious brain, between the active and the archival, that I have my best ideas. And so as soon as I have them, I repeat them like 3 times in my head. And then when I can get to a piece of paper, I write. And I'll tell my wife, my longtime, wife, we're going up on almost 30 years of marriage here. I'll say, whenever you see me and it looks like I'm not here, please don't interrupt me. I'm actually doing something. I'm processing. So oftentimes she'll see me and say, oh, now's not the time, because almost always it's going to be something mundane that could be talked about later. I often volunteer to go to the Tesla charging station so we can use the supercharger, A, because it's free to us, but because sitting in the car with nothing to do, just sitting there allows my mind to wander. And I always travel with a little notebook. I carry a little field notebook with me everywhere I go, because that's where I jot my ideas down. Now, here's the latest connection that I've been making, and I keep rethinking this. So we're all aware of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's a triangle. But if I ask most people, like, what are all the stages in the triangle, they can usually remember 1 or 2, but not all 3. And I started to look at this and unpack it, and started to find parallels between the brand ladder and also marketing tactics. And this Maslow's hierarchy of needs sits right in the middle. And it's really neat to be able to draw these connections that people haven't made before, and to be able to help them understand it in ways that they can apply it to their life and to their brand and to their marketing.
A couple of things came up for me when you were talking about taking notes. One was a book that I'm actually in the process of reading. It's called The Second Brain by Marco Forte, and the importance of taking notes and capturing that, and not only capturing that, but being able to draw on those notes quick enough at the right and given moment, and how that has sort of changed the way that I've been taking notes. I think the other thing that came up to me, just like this idea of boredom, feels almost like the opposite of how corporate culture works. It's like it doesn't encourage people to be bored. They're measured on people taking action. So I'm wondering, do you find the same thing? Have you heard of any case studies where people are now leveraging this idea of boredom, or encouraging that from their employees in order to allow them to be more creative and come up with more solutions?
I think the problem is 21st century businesses have inherited a 20th century business model. In the Industrial Revolution, turn of the century, what's happening is people are measured by productivity, and the best way to measure productivity is just by measuring your time and effort. So they think that the more hours you put in an office, the greater the product. And when it's an assembly line situation, when you're doing something that doesn't require real skills, or something that is very repeatable, yes, put in the time and the results will be there. You can manufacture more tires or widgets because you have more people on the assembly line, you have fewer down days. But when we get into 21st century knowledge, and subset of that is creative work, you can't put people on the assembly line anymore. It's not a function of putting more hours in. We've all been there before. When you have to design something, when you have to come up with a cool edit or write a treatment for a pitch that you're doing, it doesn't matter if you stare at it for 400 hours or 40 hours. If you've not done the proper mental preparation, you won't be able to produce a good idea. And that's why companies that are on the bleeding edge, the ones that are in the Fortune 100 list, I think they've learned to incorporate how to take care of the human, the creative human, such that there's ample space for them to come up with game-changing ideas. We think about companies like Google, who create pods and spaces for people to be quiet, to break away. We're moving away from having people to show up at an office and sit in a cubicle. We've decentralized the office for the most part, and we're allowing people more flexibility so that they can then be more autonomous and come up with those kinds of ideas.
I really like that. And in speaking about these spaces, I wanted to focus on video editors and motion graphic designers, who usually, when putting together some forms of content, are sitting in front of a computer in order to achieve the final task. I'm wondering, from the people that you work with, when they put together video editing content and motion graphics, what do you think the majority of video editors and motion graphic designers are doing wrong? And how can they leverage more creativity in their life in terms of being boredom, especially in, let's say, if they're in a state where they feel that they are behind in producing given work, or where anxiety might come up to meet deadlines and catch up with the daily tasks that need to be done?
This answer is going to sound really counterintuitive, Nick, in
Okay.
that I first of all, I don't know how all editors work. I do know how a handful of people work. So I'm going to have to
Yeah.
extrapolate here. You probably have a better beat on this. My theory is this, is that believe it or not, structure creates the space for you to be more creative. That chaos, the lack of rules and boundaries creates too many options. And within those options, we get lost and go down different rabbit trails. So I think a lot of creatives, because I do know creatives versus editors specifically, is that they think the act of creativity and imagination is this wild, unbound thing that's part magic and art, and it's not any part science. So they don't take any time to develop a process or system that is repeatable with predictable results. And so you give them a bunch of assets, they start working, and they don't even know why they would do what they do, mostly because they've never had to explain it to anyone else how to do what it is that they do. But if they sat back and used the 5 rule, which is something that Dr. Samuel Holtzman from Art Center taught me, which is what are the 5 big decisions that you're making such that by the end of those 5 decisions, you're going to end up with a pretty good product. And he asked me to re-examine how I taught motion design. And I started to say, okay, so we're looking at storyboards, we're looking at sequential design. And the old way was for me to walk in and say, I don't get this part, you should change this. And these 3 things aren't working for me. What is your intention? And if that is, then you should do these things. So it puts all the expertise, the knowledge into the instructor versus into the students. So the new way of doing it is to ask myself, what are the 5 decisions? What am I looking for? Such that if I were to explain it to someone, they have a pretty good shot at understanding how I make decisions. So we said, okay, rule number 1, is it clear? Because if I look at your sequence, it's not clear. There's no point for me to talk about it anymore. So as they're working late night, they have to look at their sequence like, can I even understand what it is? And then they can start to self-edit. Now, you're not surprised here. Motion designers tend to layer on more and more things because they're not confident that it's good. So they just put too many things on top of it. That's so heavy, so dense with motion design that I don't even know what the point is. And so we mask our ability to communicate with just adding visual candy. So number 2, if it's clear, is it boring or is it interesting? So if it's clear, I can see what's going on, but it doesn't spark anything in me, then it's kind of clear and boring. So then we have all kinds of tools to make it more dramatic. What if we change the angle? What if we lit it differently? What if we really art directed the set like Wes Anderson does, how he frames everything in symmetry, and the wardrobe in which he casts his characters in, or just even his casting decisions are unusual and different. So we can just go down through all these 5 things. And then by the end of it, when somebody's designing a sequence, they're like, okay, I kind of know what's going on here.
From what I've seen through my own upbringing of teaching people in video editing, one of the things that I find that is a tool that needs to be taught in some of these books is just the ability to keep your sequence organized, and how easily that can become overlooked when you're just learning the software. In fact, speaking to some main video editors who cut feature films, when they look for an assistant, the first thing they want is someone who is extremely organized and process driven, so that, like you said, Chris, when you look at a sequence, it makes sense the track that a clip is on, makes sense the color coding, and then there's also just a flow to it. It tells a story of itself without you even having to look at the visual or the frame that it represents. And I think that that can be a great tool to help with the process and allow for more creativity to flow throughout it. I wanted to go back for a second to your own process, and over the years, just seeing your impact. If you notice there are any triggers in your own workflow, things that could throw you off keel from being 100%, whether that be creative or when you're producing work, things that can throw you off keel.
I know exactly what it is, Nick, and it's something I suffer through. Until I get the ultimate assistant, this is going to be a problem. And I think the ultimate assistant one day will be like some kind of near intelligent AI. So we have assets, and we have lots of assets. I probably have 100,000 assets, images, pieces of topography, texture, things like that. And they're organized in the way that I thought in that moment. Sometimes I can't figure out my own brain, right? Or it's like a bunch of assets I've downloaded and they're called something with a number system, but I'm not able to find it. And so oftentimes I sit there and spend more creative energy and focus in finding the asset than actually using it. I think this goes back to structure and organization. And so for a summer, I had my young boy go in and do certain things to prep all the images and to relabel them. And when he did that for 3 days, it was working really well. But I still have 200,000 more images that somebody's got to go through and figure that out. So what was really exciting to me was a couple of years ago, Adobe started showing off the Sensei technology where it's like, you kind of just tell it what you want and it'll go through all of your assets and kind of figure out that's a cat, that's a dog, those are two people, that's a portrait. And then just say portrait, man, old, Caucasian. And then it should just be able to pull them up for you. And then identify lighting style and it just starts to cull it down. I'm hoping, Nick, that time is coming really, really soon. And I believe it is.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've seen some of this technology on the video front too. I believe this was like 2 years ago. There was a beta, and I can't remember the name, but you could upload a video clip and it would automatically tag that video clip and represent moments of not only being able to give you a transcript, but identify if someone had a blue shirt, mentioned a blue shirt. You saw a blue shirt in a video clip, and just being able to sift through that content and find that exact moment is huge.
Yes.
And even looking at Adobe's technology right now inside of Premiere Pro, you've got these auto transcripts. I have a feeling that the next layer, like in that, as well as in Photoshop, is this identification of multiple assets and being able to call that up no problem versus just the metadata that's entered in onto the photos, but literal visual cues that are memorized by AI.
Yeah.
And we've let the cat out of the bag. We're talking about AI right now. As a video editor, most of the tools that I use are AI algorithms that help make my life easier and automate it. But then I want to open up the discussion a bit to Gen AI. So tools like Midjourney, text to image prompts. Recently, OpenAI just released Sora. I'm sure you've heard that news about a week ago, where now you're starting to see incredible video quality generated from a text prompt. Do you think that this is a threat to creatives' jobs?
It is and it isn't. Anytime a computer can do the work that's mundane and repetitive or something that's very labor intensive, I think it's a good thing because it frees us up to think about what it is I want to do. What is it I want to say versus how do I do that thing? The images that I saw coming from Sora are mind-blowing because it seems like on one hand, we're still struggling with text to image, and now they've just leapfrogged it into like text to video. And the amount of intelligence that's going into this where things are not shifting and glitching out all the time is incredible to me. I don't know if these demos are 100% real, but my God, if they are, we're ushering in a new era where my 20-year-old son can write a script aided with AI, that it understands story formats and structures. Like it can tap into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. It can give him notes about like what's working, what's not, what's unresolved, or open plot points and open loops that have not been resolved. And then it can then help him generate text prompts so that Sora or something of that equivalence can then create a video asset for him and recommend color palettes. So he gets a look at it. It's like, do I want to do a Quentin Tarantino grade on this, or do I want to do a Michael Bay grade on it? And then grade the film that way, and then generate sound design and just assist us in doing everything that we want to do. It's not an exact parallel, but I look at it like pre-digital sensors and cameras, photography was a pretty expensive hobby to acquire, and few people can be quote unquote professional at doing it. With the advent of the digital sensor, every single one of us can take pretty decent looking photos. We can learn a lot about composition, about lighting. So people understand more about photography and about the exposure triangle than they ever did in the entirety of human history and existence. Is that making better photographers? No. But at scale, they're probably elevating the visual aesthetic of a lot of people, which is a beautiful thing. And so we're not mad at the digital sensor. We might be mad at people who don't know how to take a photo, and that's neither here nor there. So AI is an enabler and enhancer at a scale at which we've not seen before. So the concern that a lot of people have is that people who don't know how to draw, don't know how to make things, will replace people who know how to draw, who know how to make things. And this becomes a problem. And I believe it is a problem, but I'm just in here telling you at the front of this that if we have no personal stake in this and we say like, how would the future look like? Well, the future looks like AI. And so then we have to re-engineer ourselves and what it is that we're doing and the jobs that we're pursuing such that we take advantage of the tools versus fighting the tools.
I really like the parallel that you drew about a person who is drawing or a painter, and then now having someone be able to do that faster and better who doesn't have that same amount of experience. I wanted to take a second with Gen AI and talk about what are some of the opportunities that you see through embracing it. So let's for a second talk about painter, or even let's talk about a graphic designer. Do you think someone who is incorporating Gen AI into their work is going to be ahead of the game versus someone who is not adopting to these tools?
I can say it emphatically, unequivocally, yes. If you're not incorporating any tool, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. You've decided I'm going to work slower and harder than I need to. So back when I was in school, a friend of mine told me about this software. It was called Brainstorm or something like that. It was an ideational tool. It came on a CD-ROM or floppy disk, I can't remember. And we would install it, and it did mind mapping. It was branches. So it would connect you to words you didn't know. It would connect you to things in history and literature that you didn't know. So you go on these really interesting journeys in mind mapping, and I found it to be so awesome. This is not using modern technologies, not even close to AI. It's just nodes that map to other things. So if I typed in something like a stranger comes to town, it might refer to different stories I've not read and would go back in time and would show me different things, and I can explore all these things and become a smarter, more informed person. And I always thought, what an incredible asset to have, that if you're not using this, you're relying on one brain versus the brain of everybody that helped to develop the software and the archives in which I had access to. And so I could just think in the brainstorming process to say, okay, what images in Western culture in the last 30 years that are used in cinema, art, and theater that conjure up terror and then removes upset, blood, and gore. And so then I'm like, okay, now I can have an informed palette to say like, okay, I have my vision of what's horror, terror, and then it's showing me a lot broader spectrum of what people consider terrifying. And so I can look at that and I'm like, oh, shoot, this is taking me down different branches and I can explore these things. And I could see the most innocent image and be sparked with a new idea to make those disparate connections that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation about being able to connect different things that most people don't see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there's something about, I use Midjourney quite a bit, Chris, for a few different reasons, but as an ideation tool. And one thing I noticed is in through the text prompts that I enter through Discord is also a willingness to just study more about art history. So it's funny, like it's amazing that you're able to explore all of these different art styles, and then in some cases mesh art styles together into brand new creation that you probably wouldn't have necessarily been able to do by just the old methods of ways of doing things. I also find myself doing this just in Chat GPT, where I'll try to take on the perspective of someone where I'm not an expert in. So like going towards video editing or motion graphics, like tapping into how a doctor might view things or how a scientist might view things, and having that perspective of how to potentially open up different ways of thinking that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. So as an ideation tool, I love it.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd love to reference here. Yeah. I saw on my feed on social media recently where they were playing a rap from Dre and Eminem to the tune of the Bee Gees, Staying Alive.
Oh, wow.
And it was brilliant. And somebody's like, whoever did this mashup, they're a genius. And so and your expression, wow. Because you're like, what does that sound like? Disco, Bee Gees, and then hip hop. What is that even, that mashup? So that's where we live in that intersection where we call creativity. And so when you're talking about being able to imagine this art influence with something that doesn't even make sense and seeing what the machine can smash together at a speed in which would take us a really long time to explore, because you and I have both had ideas at one point in our life, whether in school, in our profession, or as an instructor. We're like, I wonder what that would look like. I don't have the skills. That's going to take too long for me to see. And so we don't pursue that. Where now, if we have the inclination, if we have a good enough reference of art history and architecture and photography and fashion, we can start to reference certain things. And that's where the real creative stuff is going to happen, we can bring those things together and create really interesting mashups. And to address the whole art thing, Midjourney has its challenges with where did it source images from? How did it learn these things? There's a lot of questions. I think the jury's out. I feel okay with it, but I'm not saying I'm going to die in my grave saying that it's fine. However, there's I think it's called Leonardo, where you say a cat at night with blue lighting and you draw something, a gesture, and then it starts to draw the cat for you. And you don't like that, you draw a different gesture, or you put something in the background that kind of looks like a plant, and the next thing you know, there's a plant behind the cat. This is wild stuff. Now imagine you're a concept artist and you're exploring like a fantastical creature from the blue or black lagoon or something, and you want to create an amphibious man or something. And you're like, okay, amphibious man creature with the face of a lizard and a tail of an iguana, but the body of a human. You start sketching, you can create crazy poses. The tools that it empowers artists to generate something that we haven't seen before at a scale. Why are we fighting that?
Yeah. And speaking of some of my favorite uses, this actually comes more towards photography, but a lot of times I'll have to take photographs, right? Or take photographs and put them into a video piece. The video piece is 16:9. Most of the photographs are 4:6 or 9:6. And now I can just go into Photoshop, use a crop tool, and ask it to generate a 16:9 frame like that. And it looks seamless. It's amazing. And I have so much more leverage when I bring this into a video editor, because I don't have to do some sort of other trick to mask the fact that I'm bringing in an asset that doesn't mask the aspect ratio or dimensions of my sequence. And it just opens up more opportunities, I think are incredible. And mentioning Leonardo AI, seeing some of the ability to just draw a squiggly figure of a man and then have a storyboard. It's an incredible way to ideate and just how quickly you can come up with concepts.
Now, do you remember a main title sequence, or maybe it's not even a main title sequence, but the way they treated this documentary film, I think it was called The Kid Stays in the Picture. Kid Stays in the Picture, I think it was in the right time, right place, where After Effects had this parallax camera where you can put things in Z space. So it was kind of, a lot of people were exploring Z space animation, creating faux 3D, but it created a new form of art, I think. So they would take archival photographs and they would mask them out by hand, a very painful process, and rotoscope them out. And then they would paint parts in that were missing, such that when the camera moved, we actually got to see what was behind the person or the pool or the plant. And it created this very strange thing where it felt like a super slow motion camera move, but off of archival images, as if we could breathe life into static archival images. Now, I love doing those kinds of effects, especially in the use of motion graphics. And people love seeing things that they could not see before. Pretty awesome. Super labor intensive. You have to have skilled artisans working on this, cutting things out. Now, we have tools to automatically rotoscope things. And if there's a missing hand, use Gen AI and you just draw it and you're like, fix the hand, and the hand is fixed. And then you cut that part out and you're like, well, where that person was missing, mask that roughly and fill that part in and fill these parts in. And probably at some point, this will just happen automatically for us. And we have tools that can extract, I don't know how they do it, Z-depth map, so that now we can like do selective lighting, selective blurring, and all kinds of wonderful stuff. And we as artists, I think no one's crying like, I wish we could just rotoscope this thing. I wish we could just hand paint and hand clone stamp and mesh warp this thing back in Photoshop, back in the good old days. Nobody wants that. So most artists that I know are excited about Gen Fill and Z-depth extraction and painting in all these things. It's because we see the utility in how it'll help us. So we're like, that camp seems to be okay. But all these things where it's like someone can just type in words to generate video or VFX or photos, they're scared of that because they're not looking at that as a tool to enhance what they're doing. They're looking at it as a replacement for what they're doing. And that's the key difference. So it's the optics and how you frame it that might determine your future in terms of like your emotional state, such that you can embrace the tools or you can just ignore them.
It's very serendipitous what you just broke down when you were talking about rotoscoping. And I'm revisiting a tutorial. I did this ages ago. I, about 12 years ago, edited a Johnny Cash documentary called My Father and the Man in Black. And the director at the time referenced The Kid Stays in the Picture. And it was like, I want all the independent motion graphic artists to watch this film because I would like photo treatments just like this. And it took them about 3 to 4 days of photo on average to, first of all, the photos were on prints. They had to scan the photos into 4K, 8K plates. They then took them, brought them into Photoshop, select the subject painfully, then have to manually with the clone tool, step by step, just clone everything in. And I took these photos, Chris, and I used that new generative fill bar, right, to select a subject. All of a sudden, I had 3 subjects selected, pretty much perfect. I just had to select the magic wand tool for one brush stroke, select and mask. Wow, I have my cutouts. And just like you said, then took a marquee tool, added that area where they were cut out from, and it cloned out the background almost perfectly. The amount of time it took me, 20 minutes to make these cutouts, bring them into After Effects, then I ran a script for this treatment. I didn't do anything with the Z blur depth maps, and then added a bunch of effects. And that cost of 3 days is now pretty much at the hands of someone who knows these tools to be within a few hours. I did want to go towards, though, I think you said something that brought up another question for me, and which is on the lines of the people who are feeling threatened right now, or the way that they are framing these AI tools. How would you recommend that they try to switch that frame? Do you think that this is something that can be easily done?
I think the first thing is if we complained about it enough, will things change? And the answer is probably not likely. It's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So if we accept the inevitable, which is AI tools to enhance creativity and hopefully human existence before we're destroyed by it, say, okay, if that's the inevitable future, what am I doing about it? How can I be part of the largest economic shift that's happened in human history? What am I going to be doing? So when I get up on stage and I talk to people about AI, people are very scared and skeptical. I say to yourself, I want you to imagine this moment in your life, 30 years from now, when your child is old enough to ask you this question. So back in the gold rush of AI, when they're making millionaires and billionaires overnight, grandpa and grandma or mom and dad, where were you and what did you do and why are we still poor? I want you to just think about that for a little bit. And I'll give you a personal example, okay? So in the early, I guess mid 90s, I didn't understand what the internet was. It was just a thing. I asked my brother about it, and he started to explain to me what was happening. This is Web 1.0. And he, on several occasions, called me up and told me to do certain things. He said, you know what? If you can think of some useful domain names, we should just register them because they'll be worth money. I'm like, what's that going to be worth? That's stupid. What a dumb idea. We now know the answer to that question. Then he said there's this company called eBay. It's kind of like auctioning, but online. It'll be worth something. You should buy stock in that company. Then he told me about this bookstore that they had lots of books online called Amazon. I'm like, nah, that's not going to go anywhere. So time and time again, technology creates opportunities for those who can take advantage of it. So I'm telling you, don't be Chris circa 1995 or early 2000s. Be the Chris today, which is when you see that opportunity, don't be driven by your fear. Think about how it can enhance the things that you love. Be motivated by that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that there's also something to be open to at least trying and experimenting with these tools to see where they might have a place in your workflow. I wanted to take a little bit of a detour right now and ask you like a series of quick rapid fire questions. So there aren't like too many rules around this. You just have to have your answer within a minute or so. My first question is to name a recent experiment gone wrong.
The launching of our coaching group called the Brand Lab, we tried to first create it for creatives and teach them more business skills. And it was launched at a $36,000 annual price. And that was not a good thing because we're like trying to sell a higher ticket thing to people we're already serving who are struggling to pay us the $250 a month, let alone the $3,000 price tag. So that was an experiment that failed, but we pivoted and we started to understand this was actually for business people who wanted to learn about creativity.
I love the fact that you pivoted there at the end and are learning from those experiments. My next question, favorite song in the last week?
Oh my God, the favorite song question. I'm enjoying the soundtrack from Dune. So it's not a new song, but I love listening to it. And I'm just eagerly anticipating Dune 2. So they release one new track from the album. And I just can't wait to get my hands on the rest of it.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm a big Dune fan myself, actually. I can't wait for part 2 with it.
Yeah, oh my God, they delayed the release. It was killing me.
Most surprised film or TV show in the last 2 months?
I really loved Poor Things with Emma stone. I didn't know what to expect, but it's a beautiful, surreal film. And it reminds me of so many different genres that I love put together. For those that are going to watch it, don't watch it with their kids. It's rated R for a good reason. But it was a beautiful story about understanding like societal demands on us and how we fit or not fit into that. And it raises that question and it tells it very poetically.
It's been on my watch list for a little while now.
So good.
Name something that the internet has wrong about you.
Usually my age, it runs the spectrum. So I've decided to finally just come clean and let people know what my age is. I've been pretty private of it, mostly because I just like creating a little bit of mystery, not because I care how old people think I am. So I'm 52 years old this year. And so you see the spectrum of like 36 to like 50 something. So
gotcha. And last question, what's a hobby that you have that most people don't know about?
Probably fishing. I love fishing. I'm an angler and I've loved fishing most of my life. I'm an outdoorsy kind of person. I like the idea of backpacking and living off grid, even though I don't do anything like that. I'm too prissy for that. But I really look forward to my semi-annual trip where we go off the coast of Canada and we spend our time on the water for like 4 or 5 days.
Oh, that's great. Where are you? Is it West Coast where you're in Canada when you go?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kai Pass.
Kai Pass. Okay.
They also overestimate my net worth because my little nieces are come up to me like, Uncle Chris, you're worth this much money. I'm like, no, I'm not. Don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Couple last questions, but if you were to go back in a time portal about 3 years in the past, and you had a chance to sit down with yourself then and offer 2 pieces of advice, what would it be and why?
Okay, so 2021, we're still in the pandemic, right? We haven't been able to travel. So it's a pretty dark time, but it was also a time of like a lot of interest in learning because people were like cooped up in their place. We saw the largest growth spurt happen in that period on YouTube and also through this app that's not really relevant anymore called Clubhouse. So the advice I would give myself is in that time in which there was peak interest and people were trapped, I could have taken more advantage of it. I could have grown our channel to like 4 million viewers if I were serious on creating short form content because YouTube was really pushing that to everybody. We had our largest growth, like we grew by 700,000 or 800,000 people in just a few months, which took us years to get to. And the relationships that I built on Clubhouse while it was a happening platform, I still have to this day. So again, doing more of what works, what gave me joy, just putting in the reps at that moment in time so that today would be in a slightly different position.
My final questions for you actually are around action when it comes to creativity, this idea of writer's block or being stuck creatively. My question is, do you believe in that concept? Do you believe there is such a thing as writer's block or being creatively stuck?
I believe in the symptoms of it. I just don't believe that's the source of the problem. I think it's a symptom of several different things. Oftentimes people say writer's block because they're putting off. So it's a procrastination strategy, or it's a mislabeled perfectionism syndrome. So they're very similar. Perfectionism and procrastination are very similar. They manifest themselves in inaction. Now, the part that we talked about that we can kind of weave together as part of our conversation is if you have writer's block or creative block, it's probably because you've given yourself no time to rest, no time to be bored, no time to synthesize and process the many different things that you're doing. And that's why people say, I'm just burnt out. Because when you're working 16, 17 hours a day, day in and out for weeks at a time, and you're not a young person anymore, it's not long-term sustainable. And I think there is something like you can rev the engine too hot such that you destroy the engine. Now, I have a friend, still alive, but he was one of the most creative animators I knew working in the motion design industry. And the way he saw things, because he was a musician and he did a few drugs here and there, but the way he could see things and translate them into motion, I have yet to see anybody be able to do that. And I thought, this person is going to be a superstar in the annals of motion design history. He went to work for a place, I won't name their name, but they just ground people to death. They just brought people in, they sucked their life out of them. They worked Saturdays and Sundays. And a few years later, he was definitely overweight. He looked like he was hollow, like I'm talking to him, but I don't know if he's all there. And his creative output was vastly diminished. He was still that curious person that had that spark, but I can just say like he lost the edge. And I've seen it happen to so many creative people. A knife keeps its edge if you take care of it, But if you abuse it, it will chip, it will break, and it'll become dull. And that's how your mind is. Second symptom is if you run into creative block, maybe you've had rest, maybe you're not burnt down, you're working normal hours. I believe you're stuck because you don't have an understanding of the problem. So you're given a brief that's not clear. So it's not with the proper constraints in it, not enough structure. So your mind is left to like go bananas and you're in chaos. Or number two, you have understanding the problem, but you've not done enough research. You don't have enough perspective on this to be able to give it a meaningful answer. So the brief is clear, but you don't understand the components so that the creativity can't happen. Your archival brain can't go to work when you haven't thought about the problem deeply enough.
Along those lines, I can get that idea of the two perspectives you shared there about writer's block. I wanted to shift towards this idea of completion of projects. So how can people rebalance themselves in order to allow themselves these moments to be bored? What do you think are some great tactics in these situations which some cultures could allow for burnout, for people to try to recapture themselves and actually become more valuable in their own creative processes?
So if you're hit in a place where you feel like you're empty and you're burnt out, there are things that you can do. Number one, I would suggest that you go cold turkey and just do a detox, a creative detox, and say, you know what? I'm taking a sabbatical, leave of absence. I need to go on a 4-week vacation. Please don't let anybody call me. And then honor that yourself by not checking emails, by just unplugging. And if you have a lot of self-control and will, then you can just do it. But otherwise, go to the desert where there's no cell phone technology and you are not allowed to bring any batteries, or just so that you can reconnect with nature. Like put your feet, your bare feet on the earth and just be comfortable in the silence and not being able to do anything. Don't bring a lot of work with you. Don't bring books or journals or anything like that. Just sit there for 3 or 4 days, not able to do anything, but just to be with your own thoughts. Perhaps even take a vow of silence, because you want to do the exact opposite of everything you were doing to kind of shock the system and hit reset. If you can afford it and you're a place where you can do this, I would suggest you travel afterwards to take in different cultures, to experience different things, food, customs, clothing, temperature, environment, all those kinds of things, just to say like, the world is a lot bigger than we think, and we've just been exposed to a very small part. Two, the recipe that's worked for me in the past when I felt like, oh gosh, I have nothing left to give, is to go and volunteer to teach somewhere, give a lecture, run a workshop, or be committed to a 7-week course somewhere at a community college, at a private art school near you. And what will happen is you'll learn so much about your creativity, your thought process. You'll have to develop systems, but the thing that you'll realize is a lot of things. So when you're put in front of hungry minds that are asking you very curious questions, it gives you an opportunity to know who the heck you are and to be seen through the eyes of people who can truly appreciate you for who you are. And the last one is to be around people, around the right kinds of people that can start to fire off those neurons that have been dormant. Because oftentimes when we work as a motion designer or as an editor, we're working in isolation. So if we get out and we meet interesting people, they share with us glimpses of their world and what they're working on. And whenever I do this, it really excites me. I get to tell people I get paid a lot of money to sit around and have conversations with interesting people. And from that, I get to share that information. And so when I talk to anybody who's not remotely connected to any of our content, they're like, wow, you have an answer for everything. You know somebody that's doing something because I'm led by my curiosity.
It really resonated with me, specifically the sabbatical, if you can take it. There was a TED talk that I saw from Stefan Sagmeister, who is a graphic designer out of New York, who talked about the benefits of a sabbatical and how that could really reignite creativity. And what I really loved about that TED talk is that you can see how his work was sort of getting very similar because of burnout, and how his time away from that changed his perspective and almost reinvigorated a creative spark in his work, allowed him to think differently. So just a huge fan of that, and just how powerful it can be just to get up and away from your desk and surround yourself with good people if you have it around you, and how important that is. So thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure. I know exactly the TED Talk that you're referring to.
I'm curious, when I see video editors who are working on personal projects, they tend to hold on to it longer than it needs to be held before releasing it. So I'm wondering if you like the idea of what some refer to as good enough, and then sort of figuring out when to release a project.
is good enough good enough? I have great admiration for craft, for people who put in their 10,000 hours, who can do something really well, almost effortlessly. And if we look at videos on the internet, the videos that were people who are doing the most mundane things, who do it so well autonomically, we were just blown away. Like the guys who throw bricks up to the guy at the roof and he just catches them, and it's just like they're just doing that. Or the 5 guys who are driving a spike into the ground and they're just working in unison. There's a rhythm to it that's so beautiful. Or the guy in India or Pakistan where he's folding the pizza box and he just folds them and throws them back and they just keep landing. It's a beautiful thing to watch. Now that comes through repetition, and I think repetition is the mother of skill, right? But how do we get those reps in? So if we create a motion piece or an edit of a film or a short film that we're making, and we don't release that thing, we're not putting in the reps because it's not the repetition there. And we're not getting what is necessary for most creative people, which is feedback. Not to say like we are soliciting opinions from people, but it's like we have an idea in our mind. There's a story arc. We want you to feel something. And until we see people feel or not feel what it is that we intended, we can't make that adjustment. We think it's super clear. It's like, I set up these 3 shots to create this feeling, and we're like, it's genius. This is perfect. And then we show it to somebody. There's no reaction. I think this is why directors do screeners, so they can see how the crowd reacts, so they can decide what to do, not to be told what to do, but they can decide. So I'm a big believer in this is going to make a lot of people upset. I choose quantity over quality because through quantity, you get to quality. That there is no miracle step, that you can't just jump from 0 and become a hero. Everybody starts out as an amateur, or as Chris Voss says, everyone is a schmuck at a point in their life. Everyone's a loser, but they put in their reps and they start to get that necessary feedback and the muscle memory that you need to be really good at what you do.
The feedback thing is actually something that I'm working on this year. One of the things is trying to get feedback earlier from my colleagues. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because the one thing is just to even show people a segment of a sequence versus like an entirely finished sequence, as in it can allow for more variations or also more experimentation in certain sections.
Nick, I want to throw this out. If you go back and look at your biography and you look at all the work that you've done, every moment in your life when you were even present, you thought that was the best work you could do. In 2000, you thought that was the best work. And then 2005, you're like, no, that's my best work. And so even the measure of best or perfection changes because we're growing, we're changing, we're evolving. At least we have the opportunity to. So when we look back at that work, this is why many creatives like, oh, they cringe when they look at their old work. But you thought at one point that was perfect. And it's not now. It makes you cringe. Like, why did I choose those colors and those typefaces? Why did I make that edit that way? It's so cringe for me. So if we say like every point in the future, you're going to look back at your old body of work and say it's pretty nasty, why don't we just embrace that? And if we can just put in the more reps, we're going to learn faster and we're going to get to that higher state, even though it'll be imperfect, quicker. And I've learned that after releasing 1,000 videos plus on YouTube, I don't even care. I'm just going to make it. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be weird parts in it. I wish I didn't say it this way. I wish I didn't stammer, or I wish I could remember the exact story or remember the person's name the way I had recalled it originally. But such is life. The audience grows, more opportunities to share the story. And then I get better every time I tell the story. And then I find new stories to tell. Those are open loops that we want to be exploring, I think.
If I were to give myself that question that I gave you earlier, which is to sit down and talk to my younger self, these would be projects that didn't live up to my expectation because of imposter syndrome that I had going on. I would tell myself to get over that quicker and say that this is part of the process to jump back into other creative endeavors. So I think it's just awesome advice. And I really wanted to thank you so much for sitting down with me and chatting in this podcast. To me, just to be able to have like great conversations with people about creativity and their process, I myself learned so much. And I'm also just excited for the people who are going to be listening to this to engage in this conversation and what it might do for their own creativity. So Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to sit and chat with me and all of the viewers here.
Thank you, Nick. I love having the conversation. I think you asked really smart questions and good follow-up questions, but also for the two of us just to geek out on film and the industry that has served you and has served me for some time. So it's just awesome to do.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll get to catch up sooner rather than later next time. I guess I'll probably see you at NAB.
Yeah, I'll see you at NAB. And hopefully, I don't know if you're an outdoors person. I'd love to see you on the water sometime.
Oh, yes. Well, you'll have to keep me posted with your next fishing trip up in Canada. Thanks, man.
Thank you.